All right, we've talked a lot about functions, and we've talked about the graph of functions. Right? The graphs of functions. In this video, we're going to talk about how to graph functions. Right? So, in other words, if you are given the definition of a function, for example, in number 1 we have a function defined as f of x equals x squared. How could we graph the function based on this information? Right? And what we're going to do is we're going to construct a table that organizes our information like this. We're going to do a table that shows us the relationship between the inputs and the outputs, right? An input-output table. All right, so let's remember what our definition here is saying. All right, this is saying that our output is going to be equal to the input squared. Right? And we can take that definition and construct an input-output table. All right, the way I would recommend organizing your work is like this. All right, let's show our work off to the side. Right? And I really want you to make sure that you do this in a neat and organized way. All right, so for example, let's try to construct an input-output table here, and let's pick some input values. All right, so let's see what happens when the input value is -3. Right? Well, to figure out the output, right, let's go back to our definition. The output is going to be the input squared. So in other words, the output when I input -3 is going to be the quantity -3 squared. Right? And so what would that be? If I input -3, well, -3 squared would be +9. Right? And I really want you to, again, to stay organized. Right? This is going to be especially important as these get more complicated. Right? So what are we saying here? When the input is -3, our output is going to be 9. Right? Or when the input is -3 here, we can put the 9 here for the output. All right, let's do another one. All right, let's how about do -2. All right, so let's think about that. If my input is -2, what would the output be? Right, well, the output when the input is -2 is going to be our input squared, or -2 squared. So the output when the input is -2 is going to be -2 squared is 4. All right, and you can really choose any input value you want, but a lot of times we choose small numbers like this so that it'll work nicely with our graphs. All right, I'm actually going to have you finish this. Go ahead and find the output values when the input values are -1, 0, 1, 2, 3. All right, so please pause right now and find the output values for these. Okay. All right, let's see how you did. I'm not going to show all of these for the sake of time in this video, but let me just do one more. Right? So let's say my input is -1. Well, when the input is -1, let's find the output. Right? So our output is going to be equal again to my input squared. Right? And I want you to please notice when you need to use parentheses here. Okay? So our output is going to be -1 squared, which is -1 times -1, or +1. Okay. All right. What would be other outputs? Check to see what you got. You should have gotten 0, 1, 4, and 9. Right? And then we can use this information in to graph our function. Right? So when our input is -3, our output is 9. Right, this one goes off the graph. That's okay. When my input is -2, my output is 4. When my input is -1, my output is 1. When my input is 0, my output is 0. Input of 1 is 1, has an output of 1. Input of 2 has an output of 4. Input of 3 has an output of 9. So here's my graph. All right, let's do our next one. Right, so this time our function is defined as the output being the input cubed. All right, so again, we can construct an input-output table, and let's find some outputs for inputs. All right, I'm going to do -2 to +2 this time. Okay, so let's see, what would the output be when my input is -2? All right, well, in this case, my output is defined as the input cubed. Right, so we need to do -2 cubed. Right, well, what would -2 cubed be? That would be -2 times -2 times -2, which would be negative 8. So when the input is negative 2, the output is negative 8. All right? Go ahead and finish this T-chart. Please pause and finish. All right, let's check to see what you got. All right, I'm just going to show one more. All right, what happens when my input is negative 1? All right, well, when my input's negative 1, my output is going to be negative 1 cubed, which is negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1, which is negative 1. Okay, for the sake of time in this video, I'm not going to show all the steps, but I really want you to have your paper really organized and clear with what you're doing. All right, when the input is 0, your output should be 0. When your input is 1, your output should be 1. When your input is 2, your output should be 8. Right? So let's see what this function looks like. Again, when my input is negative 2, my output is negative 8. When the input is negative 1, my output is negative 1. When the input is 0, the output is 0. When the input is 1, your output is 1. When your input's 2, your output is 8. Right? This one has this kind of shape. Okay. All right, and so one of the big things I want you to see from this graph is that you don't really have to know what this is going to look like ahead of time. Right? This technique of using this input-output table allows you to graph really any function. Right? By creating this input-output table, you can graph any function, no matter how it's defined. All right, we're going to do one more. All right, we have f of x is equal to the absolute value of x. Okay. And let's do an input-output table, and let's use for our inputs negative 2, negative 1, 0, 1, 2. Right? You can really choose any values you want, but these are just easy ones to use. Okay, so let's figure out what would be the output when my input is negative 2. Right? Well, when the input is negative 2, my output is going to be defined as the absolute value of my input, or in this case, the absolute value of negative 2, which is going to be 2. All right? What happens when my input is negative 1? Actually, go ahead right now and pause and finish. Right? When your input is negative 1, right, so you should have paused and finished it. Here's your answers. When the input is negative 1, your output should be the absolute value of negative 1, which is 1. Right? You should have shown your work, but here's your answer, so you can check. When the input is 0, your output should be 0. When your input is 1, your output should be 1. When your input is 2, your output should be 2. What does this look like? When the input is negative 2, your output is 2. When your input's negative 1, your output's 1. When your input is 0, your output's 0. When your input is 1, your output's 1. When your input is 2, your output is 2. Right. This graph has this straight line V-shaped to it. Okay? And we'll talk more about these shapes later in class.